Hi, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Foundation. Today's date is January 14th, 2025, and I'm delighted to be here with Sarah Leah Whitson, who's the Executive Director of DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now. She formerly served as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division from 2004 to 2020, and she oversaw the work of the division in 19 countries with staff across 10 countries. And there's much more to her biography, and we're going to get into that pretty much off the bat. But also, we're going to discuss a lawsuit that Sarah Leah and DAWN launched, in which I'm a plaintiff, and then I'm eager also to get into the work that you all have done on sanctioning settlers. So a lot to discuss for today. But to start, I think it makes sense to learn more about you. Oftentimes, one learns about organizations or sees them in the news, and doesn't know a lot about the people driving them, and making those critical decisions. And so, Sarah, would you just tell us about yourself, your career?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me, Ahmed. Yeah, as you noted, I'm the executive director of Dawn and worked for 16 years at Human Rights Watch as the director of the Middle East and North Africa division there. Before that, I really worked in the private sector, in investment banking at Goldman Sachs and big law at Cleary Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton, and I did that for about a dozen years before I transitioned into doing human rights work full time. I've always been involved in Middle East related work, Middle East related human rights work, from my time in law school and my time in college, where Middle East studies were always one of my interests. My family is a Middle Eastern background, or my mother's family, I should say. We're Armenians from the Middle East, and I went to an Armenian school in Los Angeles for 12 years and spent a lot of my childhood in the Middle East, going back and forth. Yeah, the issues about the Middle East and human rights have always been very near and dear to my heart.
Thank you. I mean, that's a super helpful background. Um, how did you transition from Human Rights Watch to Dawn?
Well, really, it was very unfortunate circumstances in that Dawn had a vacancy because the founder of Dawn, Jamal Khashoggi, was murdered just a few months after he founded the organization, but before it had actually come into being or launched in any way. And I was a friend of Jamal's, and the board members knew me and knew about me and my relationship with him. So they had been lobbying me to take over the organization. I spent a good chunk of time at Human Rights Watch and was eager to do something different. I can't say this was on my radar since it didn't exist. But really out of sense of loyalty to Jamal and his mission and his purpose, I thought I would take it on.
And so, what was Jamal's vision for the organization? Why? Because he was a journalist. He contributed to the Washington Post. He was prominent, I think, in Washington circles. What was the vision?
Well, I think very broadly, since there's actually nothing in writing or there was no sort of programmatic documents that had been set up, but really it was to have an organization that would push US government to align its policies in a pro-democracy, pro-human rights fashion. I think Jamal came to believe and to understand that the United States played an outsized role in hindering democratic development in the Middle East by supporting abusive dictatorial governments in the region. And I think he really believed that an important pathway for democracy in the Middle East would be to end US support for dictatorships in the region.
Okay, and you're kind of an insider when it comes to Washington, which is something I learned about you. I mean, you sit on the Council of Foreign Relations. You have access. Um, how do you interpret the US governments warming up to the Saudi regime, to regimes across the region that may have been regarded as beyond kind of the pale of respectable company, beyond what's changed in the past 6 years, and how do you interpret all of that?
Yeah. The United States has always had a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia from the founding of the country. The United States always played a critical role alongside the United Kingdom in helping the Saudi monarchy set up a state, serving as advisors and consultants. Once oil was discovered, the relationship with the United States intensified. Really a long-term partnership where Saudi Arabia would provide cheap oil and the United States would provide cheap security for the Saudi state. And that really has been the foundation of America's relationship with Saudi Arabia for many, many decades. And certainly Saudi Arabia has always been a repressive regime, not a dictator, not a monarchy, as a monarchy, not a democracy, with very limited freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom for women's rights. None of these things existed in Saudi Arabia, but it wasn't a particularly brutal government. I think that really changed with the ascendance of Mohammed bin Salman as eventually crown prince, and commenced the war in Yemen, leading to hundreds of thousands of atrocities, casualties in the country with this disastrous attack that really achieved absolutely nothing, as well as massively increased repression against Saudi citizens who, for a moment, particularly after the Arab Spring, found some space to start expressing their views and opinions under the prior king. But once King Salman came to power and his son, King Mohammed bin Salman, emerged as the power, he launched this very vicious campaign against anyone who expressed critical views or opinions that were just not ones that he wanted to hear. And I think that's when, really, for the first time, Saudi Arabia's human rights record became a liability and a problem for the United States. Because not only was it a liability in terms of the military exposure of the United States to in its support for the war in Yemen and support for Saudi forces in Yemen, so a military liability, but also a political liability, highlighted, of course, by the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which became international news. Here is a regime that literally entrapped a US resident, Jamal, who had been living in the United States at that point, to its consulate in Istanbul, where they murdered him, and then they tried to lie about it, and created much more of a global story because of their ridiculous lies. They even went so far as to have someone dress up in Jamal's clothes and walk out of the consulate to make it appear that he had left of his own volition, but it was so obvious to everyone that that was just someone dressed up in Jamal's clothes. So Saudi Arabia became a liability as a result. And this on top of course, the extreme guardianship system in place in the country, reports coming out about the extreme repression of women in the country at a moment when women started to speak out against the abuses they faced, against their status as second-class citizens in the country. Actually, not even citizens, just as children. Women in Saudi Arabia were what we call perpetual minors. They never achieved the independence of adults and adulthood to make decisions about where they wanted to live or where they want to work or study or open a bank account. None of these things women could do without a male guardian's permission. I think this really bubbled up, and that's why when President Biden came into office, he promised to change the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for the murder of Khashoggi. But that promise very quickly collapsed in the face of overwhelming desire for profit. Saudi Arabia is the biggest arms purchaser of US weapons in the world. It is the #1 client. And it is a very important business partner for the United States, where not only do we sell them defense weapons, we sell them a lot of high technology. Right now, we're supposed to be building their civilian nuclear plant, for example, extremely profitable. And so the human rights promises fell to the wayside as a desire not only for continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but also the possibility of normalization with Israel came to the fore. And so the pressure of the lobbyists pushing for those interests quickly trumped any human rights concerns the Biden administration had.
And so again, you know people in Washington, you've been in the space for a long time. The perspective that Saudi Arabia is a liability, has that persisted at any level of the US government?
Um, I think it's persisted certainly in the sense that there's an awareness that the United States is providing security for Saudi Arabia without getting enough in return. And with the Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia and then the massive attack on Abu Qaik, the oil facility in the country that really severely disrupted Saudi oil production for weeks, there was awareness that defending Saudi Arabia from attack was a much higher cost proposition. And part of the break in the relations, or I should say the fracture in relations between Saudi and the US, was when President Trump refused to come to the defense of Saudi Arabia when it came under attack at Abu Qaik and other Houthi attacks, because that would really mean dragging the US into a new war on another front. I think there is some understanding that there is a liability and it is a risk because it is a dictatorship, because it doesn't actually have a clear evidence of its legitimacy. It certainly doesn't have any democratic legitimacy. And so governments like this are always very brittle and prone to surprise, prone to collapse. You know, they seem so strong and then poof, they're gone. So in that sense, it's a liability. But net, I would say right now, Saudi Arabia is in a much stronger position than it has ever been in terms of its relationship with the United States, simply because of its wealth and power that have expanded so magnificently, creating now the second largest sovereign wealth fund behind the UAE's, actually. And just with seemingly bottomless wells of cash with which to acquire support for Saudi Arabia, acquire support for its interests.
And so, I don't want to talk about this for too long, but as Jamal's friend and as somebody who really has helped continue to build his legacy, um, how do you describe his legacy today?
Um, I would say that Jamal's legacy is of a principled man who drew a line, where he could no longer support the Saudi regime. As someone who worked for the Saudi regime for many, many decades, ultimately, he was more loyal to the truth, more loyal to the principles of human rights and fairness and justice, and made the very painful choice to leave his country because he could no longer remain there safely or remain as a backer and defender of the Saudi regime. I would say his legacy is one of principled resistance. And ultimately, I think Jamal is right in that there will be no stability and security in the Middle East until there is democracy and human rights for all.
Can you describe, given where you've worked, what you've seen, the landscape of advocacy organizations as they relate to us here in the United States? And then follow up to that, where does Dawn sit in that landscape? Because you don't currently work in the Middle East.
Well, I mean, I would say we remotely work in the Middle East. But you're right that our focus, Dawn's focus is the US government. Our focus is on shaping US policy in the Middle East. We are an American organization, and our principal responsibility as an American organization is to address the harms that our own government is causing. We believe that if the United States stopped supporting abusive dictatorships in the region, democracy might have a chance to flourish. These governments probably could not survive without the backing of the United States. And even if they could, the United States shouldn't be complicit in supporting, aiding, and abetting these dictatorships who brutally suppress the rights and freedoms and even take away the lives of their own citizens. So in that landscape, I would say Dawn is one of the few organizations that focuses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East from that lens. I have spent decades documenting human rights abuses by Middle East regimes and making recommendations to the U.S. government of what should follow. But I no longer believe that human rights argumentation is sufficient to dissuade our foreign policy decision makers, and that our arguments and our advocacy must relate to U.S. interests. And to craft our arguments not just from the perspective of the way in which a change in U.S. policy will help millions of people in the Middle East, but the way in which U.S. policy is harming American interests.
And so what are the levers of change here? What's the theory underpinning the entire effort? How does a starting point with this is the U.S. interest end up in a policy change? And where does Dawn fit into that?
Well, I mean, we make policy recommendations to the U.S. government of what U.S. policy with respect to each of these countries should look like and shouldn't look like. We advocate against U.S. military intervention in the region because nothing good has ever come of that. And it's a liability, both in terms of credibility, but in terms of the human lives of Americans. We advocate for an end to U.S. military support for any abusive regime in the Middle East. And we focus on accountability for abusers, using accountability mechanisms available to us under U.S. law, various sanctions regimes available, but also international mechanisms of accountability. So we are very much an organization that works actively on the offensive, I would say. If you think of a basketball game, we're on the offensive in terms of taking on the culprits and the bad guys and those who aid and abet them, in particular the lobbyists, the paid lobbyists of these regimes who use their nefarious influence to manipulate U.S. policy. So this is some of the work that we try to focus on.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, we're transitioning now into a conversation about the toolkit and about the lawsuit. But what is in the toolkit? What are the armaments? How do you think about affecting that change?
Well, it's multipolar, I would say. The direct accountability work, the direct legal work that we do is a very, very important component of our efforts because for good or bad reason, nothing gets people attention like sanctions. Nothing gets people's attention like a lawsuit. Nothing gets people's attention like a submission to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. Because then you have a state actually exercising its power in a direction that we want to see it exercised. We also do a lot of policy analysis and recommendations. We do a lot of public advocacy. We expose the role of lobbyists, culprits, abusers, and target them for public censure and sanction. And we also do a lot of, I would say, we do a lot of work to try to shape the foreign policy community itself. And I include within that foreign policy community our peers in the think tank community, the advocacy community, the human rights community, academic community, all of those who are engaged in helping develop the sausage that is U.S. policy. Because this is not just about what members of Congress do or say, or what the National Security Council or the State Department does or says. It's about a whole orientation towards U.S. foreign policy that we think is deeply, deeply flawed and in need of change. And so we take on issues of what U.S. foreign policy should look like, convening these broad members of the foreign policy community. We challenge certain approaches, failed approaches, like conditioning aid for human rights reforms. And we try to really break through in terms of new ideas and new approaches that we hope will shape a better U.S. foreign policy.
About the lawsuit. I was recruited by Dawn to act as a plaintiff for a lawsuit, very enthusiastic when I learned about the opportunity to participate. It's an effort to require the United States to enforce its own laws. Can you give us the background on Israel-Palestine here, why U.S. law, why we believe that U.S. law is being violated? And of course, you're a Harvard-trained lawyer. What are we going to achieve here? Well, what does the law actually provide us with the opportunity to do?
Sure. So the United States is the biggest supporter of Israel, the biggest military aider of Israel in the world. And in fact, Israel gets more military assistance than all the other countries in the world combined that the United States gives military assistance to. That might have changed with Ukraine. So let's just say
And that's
pre-Ukraine.
different than the purchases that Saudi Arabia conducts, to be
Right.
clear.
I'm talking about military aid. So the United States traditionally gives Israel about 3.5 billion. Actually, it's gone up now. Probably closer to $5 billion in military aid every year. But since the war in Gaza, for example, that number increased to $18 billion in military assistance. So just free taxpayer-funded military support. Now, U.S. law under something called the Leahy Law, which is an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, the law that governs how foreign aid is provided, is an amendment to the law that requires the U.S. government to prohibit aid to any military unit engaged in gross violations of human rights. This law has been around for decades, since 1997. But as it turns out, the U.S. State Department and the Defense Department, but in particular the State Department, has never enforced this law with respect to Israel. They have never once suspended military aid from even a single Israeli military unit for violations of human rights, even though the State Department's own human rights reports, annual human rights reports, every year document dozens, if not hundreds, of human rights abuses by Israeli security forces. And so we realized that this was a law that wasn't working because the State Department was choosing to ignore the law. Now, Senator Leahy himself tried to amend the law to force the State Department to comply with the law. I don't want to go into too much detail here for your audience, but even after amendment to the law, the State Department still went around creating an elaborate machinery and bureaucracy, the sole effective purpose of which was to avoid ever enforcing the law with respect to Israel, ever finding any Israeli security force ineligible for military aid. So what we decided to do is to use a law called the Administrative Procedures Act, which allows plaintiffs who are harmed by a government agency's failure to enforce a law to sue the government, to sue the agency, to say that your failure to enforce the law has been arbitrary and capricious, which the State Department's failure to enforce the Leahy Law has been, to say that these Palestinian families have been harmed by the U.S. government's continued provision of weapons to Israeli forces, despite the overwhelming record of their violations of human rights, particularly over the past year, where we have seen genocide unfold and scores, hundreds, thousands of indiscriminate bombardments of civilians, extrajudicial executions, torture, deprivation of life, liberty, security, deprivation of items necessary for the survival of the population in Gaza. And so we decided to organize this lawsuit and find the plaintiffs like yourself who have been injured in Gaza by Israel's crimes. And we just filed the lawsuit in federal district court in Washington. And now we will see what happens.
The Chevron decision came up as being important to our case. Can you explain? I don't have a legal background. What is the impact of the Chevron decision on potential outcomes here?
I would have to go back and review it, honestly, because I know it's in our complaint when we cite it, but I think that has to do with whether or not something is a political question. Am I remembering it right? Yeah. And so Chevron said that enforcement of the law, of the strictures of the law, is not a political question. And the judiciary is not going to stay out of a matter that is about whether or not the government has enforced the law. And in this case, it's really a balance of powers, right? The Congress has passed a law and it wants the executive branch to give out the money that only Congress has the power to allocate in accordance with certain rules. And it does not want the executive branch to give money to abusive security units. By disregarding this law, the judiciary does have a role to play to force the government to enforce the law. And that's what the Chevron decision affirmed, and that's what our lawsuit argues. Typically, questions of foreign policy are exempt from review by the judiciary as a so-called political question. But in this case, we argue, no, that's not applicable here because there's a black letter stricture that really narrowly relates to a power of Congress, the power of the purse, the power to determine how taxpayer funds are allocated.
What does success look like for us?
Right now, I think success for us looks like defeating the inevitable efforts of the government to seek a motion to dismiss our lawsuit, to dismiss this lawsuit, for a variety of grounds that we already anticipate they are going to argue. So if we succeed in proceeding with the lawsuit, and if the government fails to persuade the judge to dismiss our lawsuit, then I think we've already reached significant success because then we can order the government to disclose all of the documents and the evidence of how it is that for over 20 years they have never once found even a single Israeli security force unit ineligible for aid, despite the mountains of evidence of abuses by Israeli security forces, despite the fact that they have imposed these sanctions, excluded military units from other countries hundreds of thousands of times. And so once I think we have discovery and we can seek subpoenas and take testimony from government officials involved in the so-called Leahy process, the Leahy review process, I think that we will have breached a barrier in creating some transparency that we're very confident will provide the additional factual evidence to affirm our claims.
Understood. So there's a transition underway. If I remember correctly, the government's got about 90 days after the filing to prepare its response. There's a
I,
transition underway. Does that have any impact on the lawsuit?
I mean, there may be some staffing changes in the Justice Department, and I suspect that might be a reason why they will ask for a delay in their response. I think it's 60 days, isn't it? 60 days, I'm not
60.
sure. So we'll see. I think the answer is due in February, and we'll see whether they ask for more time.
And so you say that we'll have breached a real barrier to the implementation of the law, and I'm hopeful that's the case. Um, I've got my own views on this, but I want to get your perspective. Are we then in a position where we've set precedent such that the Leahy law is enforced in the future? Is there an effort potentially to claim compensation for injury in the form of sanctions, or what does that mean? Like how does this effort percolate into the policy world?
Well, our theory is that if the government were to fully and faithfully enforce the Leahy law to restrict U.S. military aid to units responsible for gross abuses, that would effectively end all military aid to Israel. that should end all military aid to Israel, because every single security force unit, or nearly every single security force unit, is complicit in gross violations of human rights. This is both because of the actual war underway in the West Bank and in Gaza, and I think very few people are aware that Israel is actually actively bombarding the West Bank, or parts of the West Bank. But this is a product of decades of military occupation, where any military occupation is inevitable to have abuses. So when you have the entire Israeli defense machinery, or the entire military of Israel is dedicated to upholding and maintaining apartheid and military occupation and illegal military occupation, it is, in a sense, de facto tainting all of Israeli security forces. And when they are operating under the command of two war criminals who've been indicted by the International Criminal Court, the defense minister, former defense minister Gallant, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, that should taint all of the security forces of Israel. So what we are arguing is, if the government were to fully and faithfully implement the law, which it is required to do, that should result in a suspension of all military aid to Israel. I think that would be a great outcome.
I agree. There's an effort underway by the Hind Rajab Foundation. I don't know if you've heard of the foundation. It's a relatively new foundation established, I think, in Belgium, named after the little girl who was murdered by an Israeli tank crew in Gaza, Hind Rajab, 6 years old. And they're seeking to identify people who have likely engaged in criminal activity, war crimes, and to seek to hold them to account. So Israeli soldiers and officers who travel to Europe and elsewhere, and then calling on, and I hope you can unpackage this, because I think I don't possess the language again, but there's a perspective on universal jurisdiction when it comes to war crimes. So can you describe that whole effort, and then is that potentially an arrow in Don's quiver?
Well, yes, I mean, universal jurisdiction cases, primarily in Western Europe, but also a few in South America, have been in the toolbox of lawyers seeking accountability against human rights abusers around the world. There have been a number of cases brought against Syrian war criminals, for example, in Germany, I think the Netherlands, obviously the infamous case of the Pinochet, who was held to account in Spain, I believe. So there's a long history of these so-called universal jurisdiction laws that allow governments to prosecute war criminals for crimes committed outside the jurisdiction of the state, because they are basically crimes against humanity. And this gives the state authority to bring these cases where the domestic government has failed to act or is incapable of acting. And so the Hind Rajab Foundation is one group that is trying to use these universal jurisdiction mechanisms, including at the International Criminal Court, submitting nominations for investigation and prosecution. Dawn submitted 43 Israeli officials, rather military commanders and soldiers who we identified as involved in violations of the Rome Statute back in December of last year, December 2024. And I think other organizations are also looking at bringing cases against Israeli soldiers, typically dual nationals, who show up in a country or return home, like some French Israeli soldiers have, or who just show up on vacation, as the recent case, I think, in Brazil, where an Israeli soldier showed up and a prosecutor said that they were going to investigate him, so he quickly fled the country. These are incredibly important efforts to give victims of gross human rights abuses a feeling that the international community is on their side, a feeling that there can be some justice and accountability, even if it is merely against some individual actors, some low-level actors. Obviously, the most important case right now is the one before the International Criminal Court, and the arrest warrants that have been issued against Netanyahu and Gallant. I hope that they are going to issue additional indictments and arrest warrants very, very soon. These are, very, very valuable tools. They've just virtually never been used against Western states or allies of Western states. And so the concern is that powerful Western states, namely the United States, will seek to quash these universal jurisdiction laws rather than see their Israeli friends have held accountable by these courts. And this is exactly why the US is now threatening to sanction and will sanction the International Criminal Court's prosecutor and staff and their families, just as Trump did before. And really, the question of justice for Palestine has become a question of justice for the whole world. And there are those like Trump, like the Israelis, who would rather burn down the edifice of international law and human rights law everywhere around the world rather than see Israel ever held accountable. And so the whole world stands to lose the protections of international law and human rights law because our government is more interested in protecting Israeli war criminals.
Yeah, and with respect, I mean, you said Trump and the Israeli government, but I think it bears including Biden and the Democrats in that statement as
Well, I
well.
mean, to his credit, Biden did lift the sanctions on the ICC when he came into power. It was one of the first things he did because those sanctions are so crazy. But beyond that, unfortunately, the statements made by the Biden administration condemning the International Criminal Court because it dared to issue these arrest warrants, condemning the International Court of Justice because it dared to find the military occupation illegal and to find that Israel's acts are plausibly genocidal, have been shameful. And in fact, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Greenfield Thomas, recently declared, when I asked her at a public gathering whether the United States would respect and abide by arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court if Netanyahu were to turn up in the United States, and she said no. I mean, that's a big FU to international law and international justice. The United States has criticized and condemned other countries who failed to arrest individuals indicted by the International Criminal Court. But it seems to think that the rules don't apply to the US.
And so then focus on the US, the biggest cohort of dual citizens or dual nationals who participate in war crimes in Gaza come from the United States, young American men and women. The second largest cohort come from France. Is there a domestic law that allows people who are seeking justice for the genocide, justice for those who justice for the victims of these Israeli army soldiers? Is there a statute locally that allows
Yeah.
that?
There is a war crime statute in the United States. It's a relatively new law, and it was actually amended to expand the grounds on which the US government could bring war crimes prosecutions against war criminals. And I think it attempted to bring those war crimes charges against some Russians for the war in Ukraine, for their actions in the war in Ukraine. I don't know where those investigations stand. I think they tried to bring it against some Syrians as well. I don't know, and I have to just because it's a new law and I've never had to deal with it, whether that statute allows for the prosecution of U.S. citizens who are committed war crimes. So that would be something to look into. It's also a law that is based on prosecutorial discretion, so only the government can bring this case. It's not like plaintiffs can use the war crime statute to bring a case. That being said, there are other statutes that, like the Alien Tort Claims Act, that could provide grounds for plaintiffs to bring lawsuits against Israelis who've committed war crimes or even Americans who've committed war crimes, and or just plain harm cases, damage cases. But for that, the plaintiffs would have to be in the United States or have standing to bring a suit in the United States. So an ideal plaintiff would be a Palestinian-American who has suffered loss or injury in the occupied territories by the Israeli or Israeli-American person who's also in the United States.
So there's a high level of, or that the higher barrier to entry here may be evidence, direct evidence.
And just standing, to have both the plaintiff and the defendant here in the US, you know, um, and then to have the evidence that that person committed the harm to them, would be a challenge.
Do you remember back during the Second Intifada, there was a case brought by the families of Israeli American victims of suicide bombings, I think it was, targeting banks and other financial intermediaries for payments to the families of bombers or others who participated in violence targeting Israelis. Uh, what if you, well, I guess the first question is, do you remember those cases?
Yeah, I do. I think like Arab Bank was one of the defendants, I think.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And so, is there a possibility of pursuing kind of a reverse track or a parallel track in reverse, where all of the support to the Israeli military, well, it's obviously been facilitated by financial intermediaries. Can those be targeted potentially as an effort to bring people to account to pursue justice, reparations?
I mean, I think so, and I think it bears exploring and digging into. I think, for example, Israel bonds should be a defendant in lawsuits, given its role in financing the Israel Defense Forces. It raises money for the state of Israel that the state of Israel then allocates to the IDF, which has been committing systematic and widespread crimes. And so it should be a target, as should be the municipalities and states that have bought Israel bonds and thereby also facilitated the crimes against Palestinians. I think there's a lot of exploring to do. There are certainly other organizations like Friends of the IDF, which is an NGO here in the United States that is specifically focused on aiding and abetting the Israel Defense Forces. And so people who've been injured, these entities.
Thanks. You cut out there. Do you mind just repeating that last sentence?
And
People
so
who've been
people,
injured.
yeah, and so people who've been injured by Israeli Defense Forces should consider bringing lawsuits against the aiders and abettors of the Israel Defense Forces found here in the United States.
Thanks. You're engaged in other accountability work, Dawn is, targeting settlers, or you've contributed. I think many people saw those sanctions levied or targeting settlers and said, well, this is a marginal effort given the scale of what's happening. So can you describe, first of all, your role and then why it's a consequential effort?
Yeah, so near the beginning of the Biden administration, Dawn actually, in its policy recommendations to the administration, urged them to sanction and target violent Israeli settlers who were terrorizing Palestinians. Back then, that was probably the principal source of violence against Palestinians. This was before the Gaza war. And so, to its credit, probably because it was going to be continuing to pursue all the other bad policies, I think decided that it would implement this executive order to sanction individuals responsible for violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And I think they hoped to characterize these sanctions regime, and the whole sort of philosophy behind them was that, well, the violence against Palestinians in the West Bank is the result of a few bad apples, these individual bad apples, fanatics, extremists, and so forth. And of course, ignoring the reality that the settlements and the violence in the settlements is a state-directed effort, state-funded, state-guided, a state-protected effort. Nevertheless, we were very happy to see the implementation of this sanctions order, and we proceeded to investigate and document Israeli groups, settlement groups responsible for violence against settlements, not just individuals. And to our pleasant surprise, we did see the Biden administration sanction 5 settlers and settlement entities, including Amana, which is the biggest settlement agency in the West Bank, that has directed grotesque violence against Palestinians, stolen their land, burned their crops, generally doing everything they can to drive them out of the West Bank, did sanction them. And those sanctions have been very painful for these settlers and settlement entities because, on the one hand, it just means that their own assets in the United States are blocked. And they can't travel to the United States. But more significantly, it means that no one in the international banking system wants to touch them because if you are a bank facilitating financial transactions for a designated person, someone who's sanctioned, then you yourself are considered to be violating the sanctions. And so basically, it really screws up their ability to raise money, spend money, have bank accounts, except within Israel. And a lot of the money of these violent settler groups comes from the United States, comes from US organizations. So I think it was pretty shocking for the Israelis to see the US actually sanctioning them. I think it had a greater impact than even the Biden administration anticipated because we did persuade them to go after entities and not just individuals. Um, but the bad news is that Trump is reportedly promising to rescind the executive order and to cancel the sanctions against these violent settlers. So let's see if that happens. I hope not. But yeah, we expect a lot of bad things to happen in the next couple of years. What can I say?
So, what's next for Dawn?
Well, we have a very major effort of accountability coming up in the next couple of weeks, which I don't want to say more about because we do want to catch the relevant people by surprise. But it does entail accountability for those in the US government that have aided and abetted Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity. This really stems from our fundamental belief and view that our first responsibility as Americans is to address the shortcomings of our own government, to address the abuses of our own government. This is on us. We can't blame anyone else for what the US government is doing. And so that is going to be a big focus. We are going to expand our accountability work to jurisdictions outside the United States because we do see a lot of opportunities there. And we want Israeli war criminals to feel the pressure around the world, to face the ostracism that they deserve to face judgment in the world of global public opinion. That is a kind of justice too. And we are going to be aggressively pursuing that. We are going to try to figure out what's going to happen in the next couple of years. Typically, those of us who are not in government are caught by surprise when there's major unfolding, major changes like the collapse of the Syrian government. We want to try to get ahead of the changes that we anticipate are going to come in the region, particularly driven by Israel, and to adapt our policy recommendations, adapt our work accordingly to anticipate what our strategies can be, where we can find measures of hope. We're also launching the book I've written with my colleague, Michael Omerman, that will come out in the spring. That is our blueprint for how Israel can end apartheid and occupation and transform into a rights-respecting state. We have long believed that the Oslo process is dead and has been a complete failure. And the challenge has been that no one knows what to replace it with, and no one has any new plan or vision. And we thought we had to fill that gap so that advocates around the world, policymakers around the world, can have something to hold on to for what happens after sanctions are effective, what happens after the Security Council forces Israel to end its occupation. We think there needs to be a plan in place that gives security reassurance to Palestinians, to Israelis, that there is a better future possible, that there is a better way to structure their governance in a way that respects the humanity and dignity of everybody living between the river and the sea.
Sarah Leah, the work of pursuing accountability can be expensive, and it relies heavily on legal teams and those processes wend their way through the courts over long time scales, years typically. How is Dawn financed?
Well, Dawn is finance not enough, I would say, but our financing comes from a few foundations and a few private individuals and increasing numbers of small donations that we're actually receiving online, which is extremely heartening and makes me very happy.
And
So
what's your
basically,
website?
oh, our website is dawnmena.org. And we're always eager to find supporters for our work, and, gifts of $5 put a big smile on my face, and gifts of $5,000 put a bigger smile on my face. But really, every dollar that comes in is a vote of support for the work that we're doing, and it is very expensive and it is long-term work. But we believe there is a virtue in fighting back and not just lying down and accepting this. And I want my children to know that I am doing my best to resist the injustices and to create a better world, come what may. And I hope everyone will join us in this cause.
Thank you so much to Sarah Leah Whitson, who is really at the vanguard of the movement for accountability coming out of this genocide in Palestine. Thank you for sharing your time and your analysis. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website at fmep.org for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. I also want to highlight the Dawn website again. So dawnmena, MENA.org. Please check it out. I believe strongly in the work. Thank you for everything that you do. Sarah Leah Whitson.
Thank you.